In terms of local debt, I think the problem just keeps getting worse. And I think there's a very deep contradiction basically in policies that are laid out by the Chinese government. And this is very common, as you know, in the Chinese government. On the one hand, they would like to reach these pretty aggressive GDP growth targets, which are still, 6.5% every year. On the other hand, the party recently has made a big deal about controlling the level of local debt. But clearly, because a lot of investment in China is undertaken by the government, especially the local government, and local governments around China, most local governments in China run budget deficits. They necessarily will have to borrow money from some financial institutions in order to reach these investment targets, which allow them to meet the growth targets, which are ultimately set forth by the central government. So as long as that doesn't change, the debt will keep on increasing. I haven't done a re-estimate of the amount of local debt recently, but my colleagues at Tsinghua University, Bai Chong-en, and also Michael Song at Chinese University of Hong Kong, and I think someone at University of Chicago had a paper recently estimating the total amount of local debt in China, and it was a very high figure. It was 45 trillion renminbi, which is well over 70% of GDP, nominal GDP in China. And if you were to add that to the official central government debt, as well as there's now municipal bonds that the central government guarantees, which are then issued by the local governments. If you add the, I think it's 15 or 16 trillion outstanding in municipal bonds to the central government debt, to this 45 trillion figure, you get to total Chinese governmental debt of 100% of GDP. Close to 100% of GDP. And so that's quite high, by all these sort of alarming thresholds that this IMF and other organizations have set forth. That is a big question. I think not triggered by local debt. I mean, I think there could be some financial problems in the next year or two. But if that were to happen, it would be triggered by some external thing, actually. Actually, this is a slightly separate topic, but China's external debt is also quite substantial. And if you counted money that Chinese companies or banks have borrowed in offshore locations, so-called offshore locations like Hong Kong, which of course is part of China, then Chinese external debt may have reached over 2 trillion US dollars. So that, for me, it's a more likely channel for a financial panic of some sort in Greater China than domestic. Because domestically, at the end of the day, the PBOC, the central bank, can just print money and roll over a lot of local debt or SOE debt, or even if, some shadow banking thing, wealth management product or something like that were to default, which actually happened in a few instances already, the central bank can come in and just bail people out. And we've seen that happen a couple times already, so we know they have the capacity to do that. So yeah, so as you well know, I mean, this is how part of how China pursues industrial policies is to just pour a huge amount of money into it, using these state-owned financial institutions, like the big four state banks and also the policy banks especially. I think it does work and it doesn't work, right? So in the sense, it does work in that they do get some things done and the capacity gets built up, right? So, solar panels, the one case that I know a little bit, China very relatively quickly became the world's largest producer of solar panels. And basically overwhelmed the entire market. Some people say even was very beneficial to the world because obviously it drove down the cost of solar power, made its use a lot more economical for the rest of the world, and therefore reduce overall greenhouse emissions. But it's also very problematic in that every time the Chinese government decides on some goal, some objective, whether it be electric cars or solar energy or handsets, then pretty much all kinds of companies begin to do that because they know that is how they obtain state subsidies and also cheap financing. Recently the big hot thing is robotics, right? Industrial robotics. So you have, former toy makers, these, low-tech companies who were making toys, all of a sudden becoming robotic companies, trying to get Chinese government loans, trying to get NDRC approval of their investment and so on and so forth. A lot of corruption obviously ensues from this process. And a lot of money is wasted. And this is part of the reason why non-performing loans ratio is so high in China, is because this kind of industrial policies just attracts really bad investment and sort of investors with very dubious intentions. There are some very good companies and they're using the money wisely or effectively, but then there are also many others which are not doing that. But I think for the Chinese government, and I think I've actually heard someone in the Chinese government tell me this, that for them efficiency is not important. Like all socialist economy, is achieving the objective that is important. So if they are able to achieve the objective of, dominating the robotics market or dominating the handset market or the solar panel market, for them that is a big achievement. And even if there's a lot of debt, bad debt that's left over from that, for them is kind of okay. But the problem is that when you keep doing this, the amount of bad debt keeps on rising and it builds up in the system. And so now, especially with growth no longer, growing at 10, 15% a year, it's at 6%, perhaps even slower in the future, the amount of debt will always be bigger than your GDP growth. So this whole notion that, oh, well, eventually we'll repay this debt because we have growth, that just will not happen. I mean, it's mathematically impossible. So total credit in China now is 300% of GDP by my calculation. And even by more modest calculation, it's 250% of GDP. In order to have 6% growth, the credit has to grow by 10%. Let's just say 10% a year. That's the monetary policy targets of the PBOC. 10% of 250% is 25% of GDP. And GDP, nominal GDP, is growing at 10% a year, around 10% a year. Once you net out inflation becomes 6. Let's say 10, actually it was more like 8% in 2016. But let's say 10, you have credit growing at 25% of GDP, GDP growing at 10% a year, you'll never catch up, right? So I think a lot of people are kind of naively optimistic about, how growth will eventually help China repay all of that debt. Growth will never do that, only inflation can do it. I'm very pessimistic about the prospects of real reform, the way that we understand it. I mean, I think things will change, obviously. If reform just means something is changing, I mean, things will change. But if by reform you mean, allowing the market to play a greater role, which of course is also what the third plenum stated was the objective, I actually don't think that will happen in the near future after the 19th Party Congress. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is, I think, and obviously none of us can read the minds of Xi Jinping, but if you read a lot of his writings, a lot of speeches he's given recently, especially after he became Secretary General of the party, he never once said that the socialist economy should ever be abandoned. I mean, if anything, I think if you read his speeches, he aims to strengthen the socialist economy, strengthen the role of state capital. Even in the most recent Central Finance Conference that just took place, the FT had a headline that says, there's going to be financial crackdowns on the state sector. I don't read it that way at all. I mean, because the wording, all the wording said at the conference during his speech was that there has to be less leveraging for the state economy. But that could mean, so the FT read it as like, oh, banks will just not lend money or provide any kind of capital anymore to SOEs, and they're going to, you know, go under or something like that. But the way that I read it is somebody else, most likely the banks or other financial institutions, will have to take on the debt of the SOEs so that they're not as levered as before, so that they can do more. And, you know, these debt solutions for the SOEs is not to force them to go into bankruptcy, but to have someone else take all the burden, sometimes even workers, you know, from them, so that they can get even bigger and, you know, play a bigger role in the economy and, you know, invest in even more sectors, and intervene and drive out private competition even more, right? And of course, SOEs have been doing that to foreign competitions for a number of years. As China, you know, rises in terms of the quality and technology, I think this is very pertinent to Germany also, because, you know, Germany traditionally obviously has a very strong role in high-end industrial outputs. But as the quality of Chinese industrial goods, like excavators and so on and so forth, increases, and as they buy or sometimes steal technology from other countries, this massive subsidies of Chinese companies, especially the state sector, is really going to have a direct impact on German companies and the German economy potentially.